Well, hello. I'm S2, and I'll be your host for the next 8.5 minutes as we experience the joy of leaderboard creation. Piggybacking off the theme of my last video, I'm going to be talking about speedrun.com again. But while last time we were focused on the user end of speedrunning, I want to take some time today to talk about setting up appealing leaderboards on speedrun.com. Now obviously there is no single right way to set up a leaderboard, and the demands of each board are going to be dependent on the game they are based on. This is purely going to be an explanation of my personal philosophy on leaderboard design in terms of accessibility, cosmetics, and organization. I also want to make a blanket statement that I am going to be showing a lot of examples in this video, both positive and negative, but I have zero intention of casting judgment upon other moderators or their decisions. Like I said earlier, this kind of thing is purely subjective and doesn't really matter much in the grand scheme of things. Any examples I'm using of other people's leaderboards are purely intended not to judge, shame, or insult their leaderboard moderators, but rather just to be used as case studies to better explain my reasonings. I have a lot of respect for anyone willing to take time out of their day to make a speedrun leaderboard, as well as moderate runs and style the board uniquely. This video is just to give pointers to people who are interested in my process or wanting inspiration for setting up their leaderboards in a similar fashion. Throughout this video, I will be working on modifying the leaderboard for Vagante, an indie roguelite platformer with a relatively smaller leaderboard on the site. I recently became the moderator for this game, and while looking over the boards, I thought of many small changes that I think will benefit the board greatly. Once the gears started turning in my brain, I decided to make this video and use this game as an example of how small tweaks can go a long way for a board. Once again, I just want to reiterate that I think the previous mods of Vagante did a wonderful job of setting up the board, and I'm not just saying that to be polite either. The board is genuinely well thought out and nicely dressed, so big props to everyone there, and I seriously mean it when I say I would have had tons of trouble making the board as good as it is on my own. Let's start with the basics, getting the basic information for the game setup. Make sure to have cover art of some kind, and if the game is in a series, make sure it's been added to that. Also make sure you have the platform for the game listed. This is a common one to mess up, and for Vagante it is also mistaken. The game has been released on multiple platforms, so we will make sure to reflect that on the board here. Now we should start looking at categories. In my opinion, one of the most important pieces of making a leaderboard inviting to look at is the actual organization of the boards. What I mean by this is setting up your categories in a way that makes sense for the game, as well as the community that runs it. The biggest gripe I have with smaller leaderboards that I come across while scrolling the site is the amount of unplayed categories that I find littered throughout. I know a lot of times these are included because logically a game can be completed in that way, but I think there should be a real demand for a category for it to have a leaderboard. The big one I see, and I see it pretty commonly among arcade games, is 1 credit clears. When I was originally setting up the leaderboard for Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, me and other moderators had discussed the idea of a 1 credit clear category for the game. We ultimately decided that it did not make sense for the game because an optimal any percent run would be too similar to an optimal 1 credit clear run, as in there wasn't many spots in the game where dying actually saves time, so it doesn't actually change the route enough to be its own category. My point is, if there's plenty of demand for a category, you can have the strangest categories you want, I don't care. But if you want your leaderboard to be approachable on a first click, cutting down the bloat is a huge tactic that'll go very far. Vagante is pretty well organized, but I don't like these EA categories much. These 2 categories are for early access versions of the game, and low runner count beside, I don't feel like they make very much sense in the state of the game as it is now. While I know obviously you can still find backups of these versions, if you go on a modern game store and buy a copy of Vagante, you will receive a new version of the game which makes it physically impossible to complete runs in this category. However, I don't want to fully delete these categories either because I think they are interesting to the history of this game's speedrun. Therefore, I am electing to move both of these to be miscellaneous categories because it will preserve the boards for people who have runs and for people who are interested, but it isn't such an eyesore when you're trying to flip through categories quickly. On the topic of making sure that leaderboards are accessible for people flipping through them and participating with low experience, make sure that you have good rules written for a category. If it really is self-explanatory, then by all means a simple rule set is fine. I also personally like to try to make a leaderboard's most accessible categories the ones that show up first, if it makes sense with the game. Vagante has 30 different background choices that each make the run completely unique. The subcategory that is currently shown first encompasses 1 of these backgrounds, while the other 29 are a button click away. This is also the hardest category, with most of the runs complaining about the difficulty. One thing I've noticed is the first category shown on a leaderboard often becomes the most run one, and if this category is where new players are dipping their toes into Vagante, then they may be turned away by the difficulty. I'm gonna swap the order of these, also because the non-DA categories have more runners than the DA categories do currently. One last thing is that for dual timing methods, make sure that runs are formatted in a way where they are correctly displayed. For Vagante, the tutorial leaderboard is insanely messed up. This is mostly due to the fact that for the game, IGT is the predominant timing method, but in the tutorial run, runners have to manually pull up the IGT in the middle of the run for it to be known. A better solution would be for the tutorial specifically to run off of RTA, but unfortunately SRC is lacking in support for this, so the best I can do is just delete the IGT value for each run. Hopefully they add some support for this down the line. I'm also going to move this category to an IL because it's very short and it doesn't really make sense as a full game category. A lot of the variables also don't apply, so this is the most sensible way. Shifting gears, let's talk about form. This is all completely optional, but most leaderboards have some degree of customization that makes them stand out, and chances are if you moderate a game, you care about it enough to want to do the same. The number one biggest asset that sitegoers will be viewing is your background image. A lot of popular leaderboards use official art or scenery from in-game. A game like Super Mario 64 has extremely saturated colors, so they used a custom dark background with mushrooms from the Mario games for easier viewing. Celeste showcases imagery from an early level, although they blurred it to round off the sharp edges of the pixels and to draw more attention to the information on the leaderboard. A game like Bomberman Hero has really appealing color choices and visuals, so I'm sure they use... Oh. Well anyways, one fun feature that you can add is animation to your background, both in terms of a scroll or an animated GIF. Just make sure it's not too distracting or dizzying to look at. Another point I would like to harp on quickly is that if you're going to add trophy icons for a game, try to make them distinguishable. Remember that they're going to be pretty small, so making sure the colors are easily identifiable helps to set them apart from each other on a user's profile. These icons for Knuckles Chaotix are nice, but this third place and this first place look nearly the same. If they were color-coded, it would be easier to tell the placement at a glance, which is the whole point of the icon in the first place. If there isn't any asset that makes sense for the board, it is absolutely okay just to use the default trophies. For the board icon and logo, I highly recommend staying with this line of thinking. If there's an icon that makes a lot of sense for the board, use it, but don't just cram any old image of the game up there. It doesn't have to be anything all-encompassing either, and since it'll be such a small resolution on most screens, simplicity is key. I like to use some sort of sprite from the game, either a common character or something from a menu screen. For this instance, I'm going to use a sprite of the game's final boss, though it is likely I will change this later down the line if I think of something more appropriate. For the logo, I honestly usually leave this as is. The only time I think it makes sense to change it is if the game has a unique font style that you can make the logo for. For Vagante, I think the form is a very strong point for this board already, but one thing I do want to tweak is changing the box art to be one from one of the console releases, as it will actually fit the formatting it gets up here instead of getting cut off on the sides. The last detail that you can change is the primary and secondary colors used on your board. And I'm going to leave this one open-ended since I'm not super qualified to be talking about color theory. Play around with it and see what looks good, and don't be afraid to ask others for opinions about it. Here we can see that we've taken our leaderboard from this to this. In my opinion, this looks much better, and I hope that it will encourage more people to check out the leaderboard. Thanks for watching.